The phone rang at 9:17 on a Thursday morning in November, and the number on the screen was one I had never seen. I answered on the second ring. The voice was careful, measured, with the quality of someone who had rehearsed the opening of this conversation and was delivering it as calmly as rehearsal allowed. She said, "Hi. Is this Grace? I'm so sorry to call out of nowhere. My name is Brittany. Brittany Walsh. I used to work with Carter. We're applying for a mortgage and the lender asked for character references from people who've known Carter personally. Your name came up in his residential history. I completely understand if this is uncomfortable. I just wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak with our loan officer for a few minutes." I set my coffee mug on the table. I looked at the kitchen table surface, the same surface where Carter's handwritten note had sat 3 years and 2 months ago between his house keys and the fruit bowl. I said, "Brittany, which lender are you working with?" She told me. I recognized the name. Regional Mortgage Company. Thorough Compliance Department. I said, "And the loan officer's direct number?" She gave it without hesitation, with the relief of someone whose rehearsed scenario was going considerably better than expected. "Welcome to Quiet Karma Stories. My name is Grace Monroe. I am 39 years old. I am a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, where I have worked for 11 years. I was married to Carter Monroe for 9 years. On a Wednesday morning 3 years and 2 months ago, I sat at this same kitchen table and checked our joint account balance on my phone. $211,000 on Monday. $306 on Wednesday. Carter had made 2 wire transfers on Tuesday night after I fell asleep. Both used his sole authorization credentials, which I had added to the account 4 years earlier during a period when my double shifts made it difficult to manage our finances directly. The first transfer was for $140,000. The second, 40 minutes later, was for the remainder. Both went to a personal account in his name only at a different institution. He was gone when I came home from work. 2 suitcases. A handwritten note on the kitchen table beside his house keys. The note said he was sorry. It said Brittany Walsh, his office manager of 3 years, understood him in ways he had not expected to find. I read the note once. I set it face down on the table. I sat for 7 minutes. Then I called Linda Park, my financial attorney. In the 3 years and 2 months between that morning and Brittany's phone call, I had built a documentation file I updated every 90 days. 12 updates. A physical binder, 3 inches thick, in the cabinet above my desk. Bank records. Transfer receipts. A forensic accounting report. A civil complaint. 12 quarterly update pages. I wrote down the loan officer's number on the notepad beside my coffee mug. I told Brittany I would be happy to speak with him. I told her I had 11 minutes. I had the binder open on the table before I ended the call. I had worked a double shift on Tuesday. I came home at 11:40 at night to a house quiet in the specific way it was always quiet when Carter worked late, which had been happening with increasing frequency over the preceding 4 months. I ate something standing at the counter, showered, and was asleep by 12:30. I set my alarm for 5:45. I did not hear Carter come to bed. At 6 in the morning I was in the kitchen in my scrubs making coffee when I noticed the bedroom door was open in the way it was only open when Carter had already left for the day. I thought nothing of it. He had early site visits sometimes. I poured coffee into my travel mug, picked up my phone to check the weather, and saw the banking notification from 11:27 the previous night. I opened it the way I opened all banking notifications, with routine attention. I read the transfer amount. I read it again. I navigated directly to the account. $306. I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then I set the travel mug down and walked through the house in the way you move through a space when you are gathering information rather than reacting to it. The master closet. 2 gaps where his suitcases had been on the upper shelf. The right side of the hanging rod, visibly reduced. His toiletries on the bathroom counter, gone. His watch from the nightstand, gone. On the kitchen table, between his house keys and the fruit bowl, a folded piece of paper. I read it standing up. I did not sit down to read it because sitting down implies a need for support and I did not feel that need. I felt something quieter and more structural, a shifting of weight rather than a collapse of it. The note said he was sorry. It said that for the past year and a half he had been aware that something was wrong between us and had not known how to say it. It said Brittany had not been the cause of that wrongness, only the person who had made him understand it clearly. It said he hoped I would find my way to understanding eventually. He signed it with only his first name. I set the note face down on the table. I looked at the transfer record again. 2 transactions. 11:27 p.m., 40 minutes apart. Both authorized with his sole credentials. $140,000, then $71,000 and the remainder. Both to the same external account at an institution whose name I did not recognize. I took a photograph of the account screen. I opened my contacts and found Linda Park, my financial attorney from our house closing 5 years earlier. I did not call immediately because it was 6:12 in the morning and her office did not open until 8. I finished making my coffee. I got in my car. I drove to the hospital and worked a full shift because my patients were children and children required the same quality of attention regardless of what the morning had contained. I called Linda Park at 8:02 from the hospital parking lot. She answered on the second ring. The first thing she said was, "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." I told her everything. It took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Don't touch anything in the account. I need the last 24 months of statements. Can you be in my office tomorrow at 8? I said, "I'll be there at 7:50. Linda Park's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a view of the Cumberland River I had first noticed during our house closing 5 years earlier. I noticed it again on Friday morning, sitting across her desk at 7:50 with my phone and a printout of the 2 transfer notifications between us. She reviewed them without speaking for 3 minutes. Then she said, "What access did Carter have on the account?" I said, "Full. Sole authorization for transfers up to $250,000. I added it 4 years ago." She said, "Why that limit specifically?" I said, "It was the joint account standard at our institution. We never changed it." She made a note. She called her paralegal and had the 24-month statement pull submitted within 4 minutes. The complete records arrived by midday. Linda called me at 2:17 in the afternoon between my rounds and said, "I need you to come back tomorrow morning. There is more here than the 2 transfers." I came back Saturday at 7:45. What Linda showed me reorganized my understanding of the preceding 18 months. The 2 wire transfers were not the beginning. They were the conclusion. Across the preceding 18 months, Carter had made 43 ATM withdrawals from a branch in East Nashville that I had never used. Between $400 and $900 each, spaced irregularly enough to avoid a visible pattern but consistently enough that Linda had identified them in the first pass. Total, $28,400. He had also made 11 online payments to vendor names I did not recognize, ranging from $300 to $1,400 each. Linda had run the vendor names that morning. 4 of them resolved to a residential address in Germantown. She said, "This address in Germantown. Does it mean anything to you?" I thought about the name on the note. About Brittany Walsh. About East Nashville. I said, "Possibly." She said, "The total across the smaller transactions plus the 2 wire transfers is $253,412. Before the forensic accounting review. There may be more." There was more. The forensic accountant identified 3 additional vendor payments, bringing the total to $258,000, $900 across 20 months. I said, "What are the legal classifications?" Linda said, "The wire transfers are clearest. Wire fraud within a marital joint account. Breach of fiduciary duty. Conversion of marital assets. The smaller transactions establish a pattern of intent that strengthens the civil case significantly." She said, "We file the civil complaint this week. In the meantime, I need you to do 3 things. Don't discuss the case publicly. Don't contact Carter directly about it. And start a documentation file, bank records, transfer receipts, everything. Update it every 90 days. Keep it current and organized." I said, "Organized how?" She said, "Like a patient record. Everything dated, sourced, and accessible. You want a stranger to pick it up and understand the complete situation within 10 minutes of opening it." I drove back to the hospital and finished my shift. That evening I started the file. The financial reality of what Carter had taken resolved itself into specific numbers within the first 2 weeks, and I found, as I had always found in difficult situations, that specific numbers were easier to manage than the general weight of a difficult situation without them. The joint account had held $211,000. That balance represented 9 years of combined savings, 2 years of pre-marriage contributions Carter had added when we consolidated our finances, and 4 years of consistent deposits from my nursing salary, including 2 periods when his development projects underperformed and his contributions were minimal. I had always tracked the balance. Carter knew I tracked it. He made the transfers anyway. The house payment was $4,100 a month. My take-home salary, after taxes and benefits deductions, was $5,800. That left $1,700 for groceries, utilities, my car payment, and the civil case retainer Linda quoted at $15,000 upfront with hourly billing thereafter. I took 2 additional shifts per week in the first month. Then a third in the second, when the retainer payment cleared and the utility bills arrived together. The double shift weeks were long in a specific physical way. I left the house at 6 and returned at 10 or 11, 8 standing at the counter the same way I had eaten on the night Carter left, showered, and was in bed by midnight to be functional by 6 the next morning. I did not have significant time to think about anything not directly in front of me, which was, in retrospect, not the worst possible arrangement for the first season after a marriage ends the way mine did. I told 2 people what had happened. The first was my sister in Memphis, who drove to Nashville the weekend after I called her and stayed for 4 days without asking me to process anything I was not ready to process aloud. She washed dishes. She restocked the refrigerator. She sat on the back porch with me in the evenings without requiring conversation. The second was my charge nurse at the hospital. Not because I needed professional accommodation, but because she had asked me directly at the end of a shift if I was all right, in the specific way some people ask it where a polite answer is not what they are looking for. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "Consistent scheduling for the next 6 months. Double shifts when they're available." She said, "You'll have them." She did not ask additional questions. Carter called twice in the first month. I answered the first call, which covered the logistics of forwarding his mail. I did not answer the second, which came 3 days after Linda filed the civil complaint. I forwarded his number to Linda's office. By the end of the 3rd month, I had covered the first retainer payment, caught up on 2 months of mortgage, and established a weekly routine that was sustainable if not comfortable. The civil case had its first procedural hearing date. I started sleeping through the night again somewhere around the end of that first season. I noted it the morning I realized it had happened, without ceremony. Then I got up, made coffee, and went to work. The file had 5 sections. I organized it on the first Sunday after my second meeting with Linda, sitting at the kitchen table where Carter's note had been, using the same logic I applied to patient documentation at the hospital. The logic of someone who knows a record is only as useful as how quickly it can be understood by whoever needs to read it. Section 1 was the financial record. The complete 24-month transaction history. The 2 wire transfer receipts with timestamps. The forensic accounting report. A 1-page summary at the front, total figure, date range, institution names. Section 2 was the legal record. The civil complaint. Procedural hearing dates. Linda's correspondence with Carter's attorney, who had argued that the authorization was legitimately granted. Linda's 4-page reply citing the specific federal statutes governing joint account authorization used without the co-holder's knowledge or consent. Section 3 was the communication record. Carter's 2 calls. The card from his firm's colleagues, kept because it was dated and documented when his professional contacts became aware of the separation. Section 4 was the asset record. House valuation. Mortgage balance. Insurance policies in both names requiring amendment. Vehicle titles. Section 5 was the update log. Each quarterly review on a single dated page, what had been added, what had changed in the case, current status. I updated it every 90 days without exception. By the end of year 1, the binder was 1.5 inches thick. By the end of year 2, 2.5 inches. By the time Brittany Walsh called, it was 3 inches and contained 12 quarterly update pages. I was aware during this period that Carter and Brittany were visible in Nashville's professional community. His development company continued operating. His LinkedIn profile showed new projects, new team members, a keynote at a regional real estate conference in year 2. Brittany's profile listed her new title, Office Director. I reviewed these profiles periodically. Not obsessively. Quarterly. With the attention of someone maintaining awareness of a situation rather than investing in it emotionally. What I noticed was that Carter's project announcements were growing in scale. A commercial property in Brentwood. A residential complex outside the city. He was scaling, which required capital, which required financing, which required lenders, which required verification. I noted this in the year 2 quarterly update without additional commentary. The binder was not built in anticipation of any specific event. It was built because Linda had told me to keep a current, organized record, and I had applied to that instruction the same discipline I applied to everything I considered important. But I understood, in the way that you understand things that do not yet have a name, that a developer who was scaling would eventually reach the size at which lenders would look carefully at the complete picture. And the complete picture included a civil complaint in Davidson County that was a matter of public record. I closed the binder. I returned it to the cabinet above my desk. The file waited. What I am about to tell you I learned in pieces over the weeks following Brittany's call, through Linda's discovery process, through public records, and through one conversation with a mutual acquaintance who reached out after the civil case resolved. I am telling it now, in sequence, because understanding what Carter had built in 3 years is necessary for understanding why the mortgage application arrived when it did, and why it was Brittany who called me rather than Carter himself. In the 3 years following his departure, Carter's development company had grown. The Nashville real estate market had been favorable, which he had navigated with the competence I had always credited him with. He closed 4 residential projects and broke ground on a 5th. He brought 2 additional partners into the company, which required restructuring the entity and created a need for institutional financing rather than the private capital arrangements he had used before. Brittany had become his office director, managing operations, vendor relationships, and administrative oversight. By year 2 she was also his domestic partner in the house he had been renting in East Nashville, which was the same neighborhood whose ATM branch appeared 43 times in the joint accounts transaction history. In year 3, Carter identified a property in Brentwood he wanted to purchase as a primary residence. Listed at $840,000. He had sufficient funds for a 20% down payment from company revenue, which meant he needed a mortgage of approximately $672,000. At that loan amount, the lender's due diligence was thorough in ways that smaller residential loans typically were not. The lender required 2 years of personal financial history, business financial statements, and character references from people who had known the applicant personally and professionally within the preceding 5 years. Carter's application included his 2 business partners and a former client. His personal financial history narrative began, in his telling, approximately 4 months before the actual date of our separation. He did not list me as a reference. He also did not disclose, anywhere in his personal financial history, the active civil complaint in Davidson County. The complaint was public record. He did not list it. The lender's compliance processor ran a standard public records search. The civil complaint appeared in the first page of results. It named Carter Monroe as defendant. The plaintiff was Grace Monroe, with a Nashville address matching his previous residential address. The processor flagged the application and referred it to loan officer David Reston. David reviewed the complaint, noted it alleged wire fraud in excess of $200,000 from a joint account, and determined that the application required verification from the plaintiff before proceeding. He asked Carter for my contact information. Carter provided my personal cell number, perhaps believing I would not answer, or would decline to comment, or had moved on sufficiently to provide a neutral reference. David Reston gave the number to Brittany and asked her to make the initial contact. Brittany Walsh called my number on a Thursday morning in November. I answered on the second ring. What Carter had not calculated was the binder in the cabinet above my desk. He had not calculated 3 years of quarterly updates. He had not calculated 11 minutes of very organized things I had been preparing, without knowing exactly when I would need them, since the morning I sat in Linda Park's office and she told me to keep a current, organized record. After I ended the call with Brittany, I sat at the kitchen table for a moment with the loan officer's number on the notepad in front of me. I had written it in my usual handwriting. The name above the number said David Reston, First Tennessee Mortgage, with a direct extension. I opened the cabinet above my desk and took out the binder. I had not opened it since the 12th quarterly update 6 weeks earlier, which I had completed on a Sunday evening in September with the same methodical attention I had given the previous 11. The update had added one item, a notation that the civil case had entered its final procedural phase and Linda expected a hearing date within 4 to 6 months. I placed the binder on the kitchen table beside the notepad. I opened to Section 1 and reviewed the summary page. Total documented amount. Date range. Institution names. The 2 wire transfer receipts with their timestamps. The forensic accountant's 1-page summary. I turned to Section 2 and confirmed the civil complaint was current, including the most recent procedural filings. I thought about what David Reston already knew. He knew there was an active civil complaint. He knew it named Carter as defendant in alleged wire fraud from a joint account. He had flagged the application for additional verification, which meant he had already determined the complaint was material to the mortgage decision. He was not calling to understand whether a problem existed. He had already identified the problem. He was calling to understand its scope. I dialed the direct extension. David Reston answered on the second ring. He had a professional, unhurried manner, the specific quality of someone who conducts difficult conversations regularly and has learned to do so without adding unnecessary weight. He said, "Ms. Monroe, thank you for calling. I want to be straightforward about why I needed to speak with you. In reviewing this mortgage application, our compliance team identified an active civil complaint in Davidson County naming Carter Monroe as defendant. The complaint appears to involve financial transactions connected to a joint account you held together. Before I can proceed, I need to understand the nature and current status of that complaint from your perspective as the plaintiff." He said, "I also want you to know you are under no obligation to share anything beyond what you are comfortable disclosing." I said, "I understand. I want to be equally straightforward with you, Mr. Reston. I have a documentation file covering the transactions that form the basis of the civil complaint. It includes bank records, transfer receipts, a forensic accounting report, and the complete civil complaint with all procedural updates. I can walk you through the relevant sections if that would be useful." David Reston was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said, "Yes. That would be very useful. Can you give me a moment to open a case record for this call?" I said, "Of course." I heard the brief silence of a placed hold. I looked at the binder open on the kitchen table. Section 1 Summary Page. $258,900, documented across 18 months of smaller transactions and 2 wire transfers on a Tuesday night in September, 3 years ago. David Reston came back on the line. He said, "Ms. Monroe, I'm ready when you are." I said, "I'll start with the wire transfers." I turned to page 1 of section 1. I started with the wire transfers because they were the clearest and because they established, in the first 4 minutes of the call, what kind of documentation I was working with. I described the transfer amounts, the timestamps, the authorization credentials used, and the destination account. I told David Reston that the authorization Carter had used had been legitimately added to the account 4 years earlier with my knowledge and consent, during a period when my work schedule made direct financial management difficult. I explained that both transfers had been made without my knowledge while I was asleep, using that authorization, in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. David was taking notes. I could hear the rhythm of his typing between sentences. I said, "I have the complete transfer receipts with timestamps in my documentation file. I can email them to you directly after this call." He said, "Yes, please do that." I moved to section 1 summary page and read him the total documented figure, $258,900, and explained that this included not only the 2 wire transfers but also 43 ATM withdrawals over 18 months from a branch I had never used, and 11 vendor payments to entities that resolved to a residential address in East Nashville. The typing stopped. He said, "The ATM withdrawals, those were from the joint account?" I said, "Yes. They appear in the 24-month transaction history that my financial attorney requested in the first week. I have the forensic accounting report that identifies and categorizes all of them." He said, "You have a forensic accounting report?" I said, "Yes. Commissioned through my attorney within 6 weeks of filing the civil complaint." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ms. Monroe, I want to be transparent with you. The application we received did not include any disclosure of a pending civil complaint." I said, "I know." He said, "Under our compliance standards, an undisclosed civil complaint alleging financial fraud is a material omission in a mortgage application of this size." I said, "I understand. The complaint is public record in Davidson County. The case number is on page 1 of section 2 of my documentation file, along with the filing date and all subsequent procedural updates." He said, "Can I ask, how long have you maintained this file?" I said, 3 years. I update it every 90 days. The 12th quarterly update was 6 weeks ago. He was quiet for 4 seconds. 4 seconds of silence from a loan compliance officer during a call of this nature is a specific kind of silence, the silence of someone reorganizing what they believed the call was going to be. He said, "I would like to receive the complete documentation. Email, if that works. I need to refer this to our compliance director before I can proceed with anything else on this application." I said, "I'll send it within the hour." He said, "Ms. Monroe, thank you for being this thorough." I said, "The documentation exists because my attorney told me to maintain it. I maintained it because that was the right thing to do." We ended the call at 41 minutes. I closed the binder. I scanned and attached 11 documents, the wire transfer receipts, the forensic accounting report summary, the civil complaint cover page, and the Section 1 financial summary, and sent them to the address David Reston had provided. Then I refilled my coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the November quiet. Carter called me at 7:14 on a Friday evening, 6 days after my call with David Reston. I was in the middle of making dinner when my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen for the first time in 2.5 years. I had unblocked his number after the civil complaint was filed, on Linda's advice, so that any communication from him would be documented rather than blocked. I let it ring 3 times. Not because I was uncertain about answering, but because I was in the middle of something and I finished what I was doing first. I said, "Hello, Carter." He did not open with a greeting. He said, "What did you tell the mortgage lender?" His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not anger exactly. Something underneath anger, the specific register of someone who has just discovered that a situation they believed they had managed is considerably less managed than they understood. I said, "I told them the truth." He said, "You sent them documents. You sent them the civil complaint." I said, "I sent them the documentation they requested." The loan officer asked me to describe the civil complaint and its basis. I described it accurately and provided supporting documentation. That is what a character reference involves, Carter. Accurate description. He said, "You know what this is going to do to the application." I said, "I know what the documentation does to the application, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That money, I had authorization. My attorney has said from the beginning that the authorization was legitimate." I said, "Your attorney has argued that the authorization was legitimately granted." He has not argued, because he cannot, that it was legitimately used. Those are different arguments. Linda has addressed that distinction in detail in her responses to your attorney's filings, all of which are in the civil case record. He said, "Grace." I said, "Carter." He said, "I need you to call the lender and clarify that this is a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. I need you to tell them the authorization was valid." I said, "The authorization being valid is not in dispute. Its use is what the civil case concerns. I am not going to contact the lender to characterize the situation differently than I described it, because the way I described it was accurate." He said, "This is going to cost me the house." I said, "I know." He said, "That is what you wanted." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the Tuesday night 3 years ago when he had been to the bank while I was asleep. I thought about the note. I thought about $306. I thought about double shifts and the retainer payment and 12 quarterly updates and the specific discipline of building something over 3 years without knowing exactly when it would become relevant. I said, "What I wanted was $258,900 returned to me. I still want that. The civil case addresses that. What I told the lender is a separate matter, and what I told them was accurate." He said nothing. I said, "I need to finish making dinner. Good night, Carter." I ended the call. I set the phone on the counter. I noted the call in the Section 3 communication log that evening, with the date, time, and a brief summary of the substance. Then I finished making dinner. The civil case reached its resolution 4 months after my call with David Reston, in a settlement conference Linda Park attended on my behalf on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She called me at 4:52 when it was done. She said, "Full documented amount, plus interest. Structured payments over 30 months with a personal guarantee." He accepted this afternoon. I said, "The personal guarantee was the important part." She said, "I know. It's in." I thanked her. She said, "I want to say something before I let you go. In 14 years of practice, I have rarely seen documentation maintained this consistently over this period of time. The quarterly updates, the organization, the completeness, it made the difference in this settlement." He settled because contesting the documentation would have cost him more than accepting the terms. I said, "I maintained it because you told me to." She said, "I tell many clients to maintain documentation. Not all of them do it the way you did. Good night, Grace." The mortgage application for the Brentwood property had been formally denied 6 weeks after my call with David Reston. His compliance director had determined that the undisclosed civil complaint constituted a material omission under the application's disclosure requirements. The application was denied. The 30 months of civil settlement payments began in April. Each payment arrived on the 15th of the month. I noted each one in the financial record section of the binder. By the end of the first year, I had reduced the mortgage balance by a significant amount and fully restored the operating savings I had spent on legal fees across the preceding 3 years. By the end of the second year, I had covered the remainder of the documented loss and had, for the first time since the morning I found $306 in our joint account, more savings than I had begun with. I noted that date in the update log. Not to celebrate it. To know when it was. My sister came to Nashville for a weekend in the spring of the first settlement year. We sat on the back porch the same way we had sat there in the weeks after Carter left. On the second evening I told her this. I was not patient because I am a patient person. I am not particularly patient. I was patient because I understood, from the first morning, that the only instrument available to me that Carter could not take, contest, or redirect was the complete record of what he had done, maintained carefully enough that no one who read it would need to take my word for anything. That is what 3 years built. Not revenge. A record. And a record, properly maintained, is the most durable thing a person can construct in response to being told they have nothing left. Lessons from this story. The first lesson is about authorization and intent. Carter had legitimate authorization to access the joint account. He used it without consent, at night, on the eve of his departure, for transfers that benefited only himself. The legal distinction between legitimate access and legitimate use is not subtle. It is the distinction that matters. When someone is granted trust and uses it as a mechanism for theft, the trust does not become complicit in the theft. It becomes evidence of the theft's severity. The second lesson is about the specific uselessness of the immediate response. In the hours after finding the note and the balance, I could have called mutual friends, posted online, contacted Carter's employer, or done any number of things that would have felt like action and functioned as noise. Noise deteriorates. A forensic accounting report does not. The documentation I built in silence over 3 years was worth, in the settlement room, considerably more than any public response I could have made in the first week. The moment of betrayal is the worst possible moment to speak. It is the best possible moment to start writing things down. The third lesson is this: the person who leaves with the money is betting that you will not have the organizational discipline to document what they have taken over 3 years, update it quarterly, and be prepared when the verification call arrives. That bet is a calculation about your character, made by someone who has just demonstrated the limits of their own. The most complete response to that calculation is not confrontation. It is making the bet wrong.